Hi, I'm Dr. Craig Bax. I'm the founder and the chief medical officer of the Cure Center for Chronic Disease. Uh, thecurecenter.life is our website. I encourage you to come visit us and take a look, including at this page with a lot of images that I use to educate my patients one-on-one, and in this case, hopefully as a larger audience. Today I want to talk a little bit about insulin resistance. I think we're hearing more and more about this in the general media. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the mechanisms, just to say that it is the number one cause and driver of chronic inflammation and also arterial disease, which is what I focus on primarily. And so insulin resistance in stages leads to pre-diabetes and ultimately type 2 diabetes. But by the time type 2 diabetes is defined as elevated blood glucose beyond a certain level, the real problem is that the body has lost the ability to produce enough insulin to overcome insulin resistance. So I use this graph all the time to explain to my patients what insulin resistance is. So that as we develop more and more insulin resistance, we keep our blood glucose normalized by putting out more insulin to overcome that resistance. So it's a lot like driving your car with the left foot on the brake and your right foot on the accelerator, having to give it more and more gas to get it moving at the same speed. And that's not a very good situation for your car. You wouldn't want to buy that car from somebody who drove it that way, because not only are the brakes smoking, the engine is also on fire. And so there's just a lot of friction in the entire system, and this creates problems. Now, I know this is a metaphor, but it really is essentially what happens. There are complex biochemical reasons why these things happen, but the end result is the same. And it really affects almost all of us, to be honest with you. You might say, well, why is it that something that's so common is so bad for us, or the converse, something that's so bad for us, why is it so common? Wouldn't it be selected out of our gene pool over generations? And the answer is, well, it's not really a bug in our software. It's a feature, because our ancestors survived in a food environment that they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. Typically, they were hunter-gatherers. They might go feast, find a food source, be able to store fuel in the form of fat. They took the sugar and turned it into fat, and then burned it for days afterward when food might again be scarce. And so it was actually a mechanism to survive in that environment, not in the grazing environment where we eat 3 meals a day, often with snacks, highly processed, sugary, starchy food. So that's why I say to people, stay away from the bad S's, the sweets, the starches, the snacks, and the seed oils, if you want to add that, and the sitting. And try to eat within a 6-hour window, kind of re-engage in that hunter-gatherer simulation, if you will. I mean, most of us are not going to, feast one day and fast for several days. Socially, it's a very awkward way to live. But the more you can approach that, the better off. And so the key to overcoming insulin resistance is to do less of the things that cause it, and that's sweets and starches, and a sedentary lifestyle. So as we decrease our insulin resistance, our insulin levels drop. Turns out that high insulin levels are pro-inflammatory, so anything that raises your insulin levels, like taking insulin instead of cutting out sugar, or drugs that increase insulin levels, like sulfonylureas, that are known to cause more heart attacks and strokes because they are pro-inflammatory, those should be abandoned in favor of strategies that lower insulin needs, like eating less sweets and starches, or maybe drugs that specifically address insulin resistance, like a group of drugs, it's a long name, the thiazolidinediones. The most common is Actos or pioglitazone, but there are supplements that also tend to address insulin resistance without having to resort to a pharmaceutical, like bergamot, one of my favorites, chromium, cinnamon, alpha-lipoic acid. And some of these come in combinations, but really the key thing is most of this can be managed, unless it's pretty far advanced, by simply cutting out sweets and starches. I talked to a woman today who actually did this for 3 weeks, and she lost 15 pounds. Now, She did start to do some strength training too, and she actually gained some muscle mass in the process. So I always say to people, it works almost every time it's tried. There are exceptions. I'm not going to lie. I saw another gentleman who swears up and down that he's doing everything in terms of his diet, and yet he still continues to gain weight. But he's so obese and overweight that his regulatory mechanisms may be sort of beyond our control. Plus, there's another issue with untreated sleep apnea that might be putting out a lot of cortisol and stress that's making it harder for him to lose weight. But the point is that if you follow and pay attention to this graph, reduce your insulin resistance by cutting out sweets and starches, losing fat, exercising more, building muscle for strength, you will become less insulin resistant. You'll have less hyperinsulinemia. You'll have less inflammation. And this happens even in the face of a normal blood glucose. So this can happen to thin people as well as fat people, depending on how we're genetically wired. How do we know? Well, my favorite tool is the InBody body composition analyzer. It tells us a lot about your visceral fat and also provides a yardstick by which we can measure your progress when you make changes and try to get into a better situation. There are fancy tests like HOMA IR, insulin levels, glucose tolerance tests, with or without insulin levels. These are interesting, but they're really not all that necessary. They add a lot of extra burden. They burn people out, and they overcomplicate things. One of the biggest hindrances to progress, I think, is over-engineering processes. Keep it simple. Silly, I guess I have to say now. We used to be able to say stupid, but now I can't say that anymore. But the point is that if you really just stay away from those bad S's that I've talked about, the sweets, the starches, the snacks, the sitting, and the seed oils, your insulin resistance will go down, your visceral fat will diminish, and your chronic inflammation will diminish, and your overall health will improve, and even see a regression of arterial disease in many cases. What happens when you make your arteries thinner and healthier again? Your risk of a heart attack, stroke, dementia, chronic kidney failure, all diminish. And the chances for a long and optimal life are greatly enhanced. No guarantees, but greatly enhanced. So cut out those bad S's, lower your insulin resistance, and be healthier.